Welcome to The Future Unleashed from Lincoln College, Oxford. I'm your host, Helen O'Hara, and joining me today is Peter Dawson, an expert in the UK penal system. Following his graduation from Lincoln College, Peter spent 15 years working for the Home Office, including 2 spells at the then prison department. That culminated in a stint on the prisons board. He left Whitehall in the late 1990s to pursue a career as a prison governor, working at His Majesty's Prison Brixton, HMP Downview, and finally HMP Highdown in Surrey. After leaving the prison service, Peter joined the Prison Reform Trust before becoming director of that in 2016 and held that post until his retirement from there in 2023. He's now a visiting fellow at the Institute of Criminology at the University of Cambridge. So today we are in the Williams Room here at Lincoln College, which overlooks Chapel Quad behind me. Originally this was part of a much larger space which was built in the late 15th century as part of the rector's lodgings. It served in that function until the 1930s, when it was repurposed as part of a pair of rooms as function rooms and meeting rooms. Renamed the Williams Room at that time, it bears a piece of 17th century stained glass in the window behind me, which shows the coat of arms of Richard Fleming, the Bishop of Lincoln who founded the college. It has recently been refurbished in the arts and crafts style, which was evoked by the existing fireplace and doors. We're very pleased to be in the newly reopened room. Welcome, Peter.
Hi.
So, the prison service seems like a very challenging career choice. What was it that led you to that in particular?
Well, it wasn't a choice. I left university, like many people, very clear about all the things I didn't want to do. No idea really about what I did want to do. Found myself in the civil service and got posted to a bit of the Home Office, as it then was, that deals with prisons. So writing policies and speeches and answering letters about prisons without understanding anything at all about them. But that required me to visit prisons, and I think you know pretty quickly when you visit a prison whether you are going to be fascinated by it or repelled. I was definitely fascinated. Really, if you're at all interested in people, in institutional dynamics, in some of the big sort of moral and philosophical questions that come with prisons, then it sucks you in very quickly. And of course, I discovered once I was visiting prisons that I just came across some really nice people, some very impressive people, enjoyed that aspect of it. I think then eventually there's a moment where you realise it's not just interesting, it's really important. And then there's a third stage, which, to be honest, took me a very long time to get to, which is where it becomes really troubling that you've chosen to do that as a career. But that was late in the day for me.
So I'm guessing the prison governor move came somewhere in the middle of that process?
Yes, it's my small act of rebellion, really. All my family were teachers. Becoming a civil servant was different and strange. Becoming a prison governor, of course, was really strange. There was a scheme which the prison service ran, which allowed people who had worked on the administrative side of the service to move into the operational side, so working in prisons. This is shallow and shameful, but visiting prisons, you'd go into the office of the governing governor, that's the person in charge of the whole thing, and just think, crikey, there is the emperor in his empire headquarters, often behind a big desk with a big chair, command of all he or she surveyed. Interesting thing, there were quite a lot of senior women in the prison service too. So yes, there was that attraction of being in a situation where you could influence a whole institution, but also just this fascination, this difference about it, and a wonderful variety of people. The civil service in Whitehall, full of clever, thoughtful, impressive people. So are prisons, but every other possible variety of humanity as well. So that was really stimulating and rewarding, and it did. By that stage, I knew enough to feel that it was really important.
In preparation for becoming a prison governor, you actually spent a little stint as a prison guard. So what was that like, coming from Whitehall?
I was hopeless as a prison officer. That's the first thing to say. And to all the people out there who do it for a living properly, I kind of apologise for the mistakes I made. I had 6 weeks training, which was about standard, and then spent 3 months in Brixton prison, which was a kind of medieval institution, really. Long enough to make a lot of mistakes from which you learned a lot. Long enough to really know what it feels like to be an officer. And I made notes at the end of my 3 months, and none of those notes really were about procedures. I mean, every day is a kind of chaotic miracle in a prison. But what I remember is what it felt like. So what it felt like when there was an incident, what it felt like in the middle of the night when you might have a dozen staff on duty and 800 prisoners, what it felt like when you witnessed something and you weren't sure whether it was actually very wicked or what was normal, when you had made a mistake and you didn't know what the consequences for you were going to be, all of which was just invaluable when I became a governor. You had to enforce standards, and actually bad prison officers are the things that make prisons awful, dangerous places. But you have to have some kind of empathy with the pressures that people face. And often that is the pressure of acres of boredom, acres of nothing happening, and then suddenly making judgments on the hoof at a moment's notice, potentially about life and death issues.
Yeah. Sort of like they say about war, it's 99% waiting and then sudden panic.
Yes, I think that's right. And the thing about the boredom, and I've never worked in the services, but people might well say the same thing. You get to the point where you kind of want something to happen, and that's really dangerous, because if you're a governor, a good day in prison is a boring day. It's when nothing bad happens. If you're a bored officer, sometimes you want something to happen.
So you mentioned in one of your earlier answers the sort of the philosophy of prisons, and there's obviously different justifications, if you like, or different explanations for the existence of prisons that have been offered over the years with sort of varying levels of enthusiasm. So there's the retribution aspect, there's the rehabilitation aspect, and there's the simple sort of removal from society aspect. We need to take dangerous people away. What's your impression of what prisons actually do in relation to those aims?
Well, it's fascinating. I think everybody who either lives or works in a prison at some point has to try and work out the answer to that question for themselves. And there are lots of different views. The view I've reached eventually, and this is sort of 3 decades in the formation, is that prison is punishment, and it's regulated punishment, regulated retribution. And it's dangerous to put too much else on it. So there are other things that can happen in prison. And the law sets out purposes of sentencing which include public protection, so keeping very dangerous people away from the place where they could commit crime. It talks about rehabilitation, so helping people to get to the point where they don't do again what they did that got them in prison in the first place. But I think actually you've got to concentrate on the reason that you have this necessary evil, because it's inflicting suffering. I mean, that's why I said it, eventually you should be troubled about doing that for a living. I didn't grow up thinking what I want to earn my money doing is making people suffer. But prison is designed to do that, and prison does do that. It does it very effectively. It does it very effectively principally through exile, but actually through all the day-to-day consequences of taking away someone's liberty and making them subject to the authority of another human being. So to justify doing that to people, you've got to be very clear. And I think it is that if you don't take retribution into the ownership of the state and you leave it unregulated, then the consequences are catastrophic. But of course, once you do take it into the ownership of the state, it comes with massive responsibilities. And typically, those responsibilities aren't met. I mean, I would say in this country, they're not met to a significant degree. Through history, through the world, they're not met to a massive degree. So you're doing a very responsible, but also a very dangerous thing.
So what could be better in that respect? What needs to sort of change for you?
I think you can only mitigate it. I mean, the retribution, this is a rather sort of dismal view of human nature, but I don't think it's wrong, is that when something really bad happens, there is a natural instinct for something bad to happen to the person who did it. And we are much more sensitive to harm caused by one human being to another particularly where it's deliberate harm, than we are sensitive to any number of other harms. Realistically, it is much more dangerous to cross the road than to walk in a city at the risk of being mugged or murdered. But when that crime is committed in such a personal way, it really matters. And there is this instinct of retribution, so you've got to absorb that somehow. The way in which you do that, I guess the two things are, first of all, you should do it with humanity. And I've just finished a project going around asking prisoners what they think makes a good prison officer. And the phrase that came up over and over again was, I want to be treated like a human being. It's very, very basic. You mustn't lose sight of the fact that someone loses either their rights or their personality, their characteristics as a human being, because they happen to have done something that's broken the law. The second thing is that you should do it with moderation, and that you shouldn't punish more than you have to in order to achieve that absorbing of the retributive instinct. And that, of course, is the thing that we've completely lost sight of over the last 2 or 3 decades, the prison population crisis, the fact that we haven't got space to lock up all the people that the courts send there, is because sentences for serious crime have become hugely longer. In my view, excessively so. And that has all sorts of consequences just in terms of resources. We spend money on prisons that is purely because we've wanted longer sentences. But it starts to undermine the legitimacy of what we're doing. Excessive punishment makes it difficult to justify why you're doing it at all.
A lot of those longer sentences, I guess, come from the way that prisons or crime or punishment, whatever you want to call it, can be used as a bit of a political football. Crime really does become sort of top of the agenda. Everybody wants to be tough on crime, always. So can prisons be more than just places to lock people up and sort of, give yourself a nice headline in whatever paper you're most worried about and show how tough you are?
Yes, they can, but it's really important to take a step back and not to load too much onto punishment in problem solving. So I think people are absolutely right to be worried about crime, and especially about our response to crime. We have a system that just isn't working. Far too much crime isn't investigated. Lots of crime that should result in prosecution doesn't result in prosecution. Prosecution takes years. We have poor decisions in courts. We have innocent people locked up for years. We have guilty people who go free. We have a defence system that doesn't work because there's no money going into it. So there is a real crisis. And if that feeds through into a lack of public confidence, then there are all sorts of dangerous consequences that flow from that, quite apart from victims of crime not getting justice. So there is that crisis. Prisons can't solve any of that. What prisons can do, and I've seen it done, in a few very modest ways I might have run prisons where it did happen, is that it can give people a second chance and a third chance and a fourth chance and a fifth chance. It's crucial to recognise that this shouldn't be a one strike and you're out system. It can demonstrate humanity and standards and compassion, which a lot of the people in prison have just never come across in their life at any point. So it can symbolise what you're like as a society. All sorts of famous people have said prisons are a litmus test for your society. It's a bit of a cliche, but it is true. And a healthy society has prisons. Prisons which aren't overcrowded, where conditions are decent, where people are treated well, where families are treated well. We always forget that when you send someone to prison, often the harshest punishment falls on the family who've done nothing wrong. So that's a characteristic of a healthy society. The extent to which prisons might prevent future crime, I'm pretty sceptical about. Which is not to say that when I was running prisons, or now when I think about prisons, I don't want them to be places which offer the opportunity of people succeeding when they go out. But I prefer that phrase to rehabilitation, because rehabilitation sounds like you're changing somebody. And the prison service talks about that quite a lot. I didn't meet many people in prison where I thought you need to change your personality. Plenty of people where I thought you could behave differently. A few people where I thought, actually, you're just ill in a way that we don't understand. But the place people stop committing crime is not in prison, it's after prison. And when people come out of prison, the support they receive is pretty pathetic a lot of the time, which is not the fault of the probation service, it's not well resourced. But also we place so many obstacles in the way of somebody starting their life again. So at the very start you talked about sort of second chances, paying your debt. I think that's a really healthy way to think about punishment. So we want to get our own back. It's a form of revenge. But once we've done that, that should be it. I mean, you think about, if you punish your children, you want it to be over. And you want to say, that's it, we're moving on. And we don't do that with prisons. You come out and your record, particularly a record of imprisonment, prevents you doing any number of things that you could perfectly safely do. It prevents you doing all sorts of things that are just normal and necessary to any kind of life, like getting a mortgage, like getting insurance, like being married to someone whose profession they have to give up if they are married to a former prisoner. I mean, it is extraordinary how many things impinge on your life. And one of the things at the Prison Reform Trust, which I was proud of, was that although we always selected completely on merit, and it was a small popular charity, we had very strong fields, we did end up with between a third and a half of the people who worked there had been in prison themselves. And not necessarily doing jobs where that was directly relevant, but it was true. And one of the things I found was that people who were tremendously impressive, resourceful individuals just needed help from time to time for years after they'd left prison. And that's self-defeating. So yeah, prison can prepare people. For some people, it's a necessary interruption to a very chaotic, very damaging lifestyle. It can do some things, particularly around substance misuse, which may help people to live a more sensible life when they get out. It sometimes does things to help people think a bit straighter, though most of that, I think, just comes with growing up. But it can't solve all the problems when someone comes out. That's when they really need the help.
Well, that's interesting. So one of the initiatives that you undertook as governor of, I think, High Downs in 2009 was this sort of prison-based restaurant. So that was about, teaching skills, kind of opening prisoners, I guess, back up to the world a little bit. Was that a success? What are the sort of the positives of initiatives like that?
It was all of those things. Was it a success? Well, one of the brilliant things about it was that having set it up, it was then taken over as a charity, interestingly by people with a business background, and I think that's one of the reasons that it's still thriving. They've had evaluations that show pretty good returns on investment in terms of reoffending. You have to be very careful with that because reoffending is a measure of the crime that gets investigated and prosecuted. For me, as a governor, it was a success because it carried a huge symbolic value, both inside the prison and outside. Inside the prison, it was a way of saying we can be ambitious and daring, we can be different, we can be better, if you like, than prisons like this normally are. Staff could go and eat in the restaurant. It was quite important, actually, for staff to see that prisoners could do something to a fantastically high standard. I mean, the guy whose inspiration it really was, my catering manager, he said, we're only going to do this if it's a cordon bleu restaurant. And it was fantastic food, fantastic service. It was all done to tremendously high standards. So it was important inside the prison for the messages it sent. But in the last year I was there, when it was operating fully, we had nearly 10,000 people come through the prison gate to eat in the restaurant and to be served by prisoners. And the comments book was just overflowing with, what a nice young man served my food, what fabulous food. So that's 10,000 occasions, not necessarily 10,000 individuals, but 10,000 occasions on which somebody who was never going to go inside a prison had the experience of the intimidating, unpleasant experience of going through the gate, being surrounded by barbed wire, being probably a bit unnerved, maybe scared by it, and coming out thinking, I met a really nice young man. It's very simple, but it's so important, and it is the key to changing the public debate to say that we want to demonise, we want to stigmatise people. All societies do, and they find different groups of people to do it to. Prisoners is one of the groups that we've chosen to do it to. And guess what? It turns out that prisons are oversupplied with people from ethnic minorities, people from overseas, young people. And so we're just disadvantaging all the people that we normally pick out anyway.
Now, from what you were saying before, a lot of the problems that, the tabloids or whatever, or politicians are turning to prisons to solve actually start long before anyone goes to prison and continue long after anyone leaves prison. But that said, given an unlimited budget, what could be done to make prison better, I guess? What could, whatever your sort of priorities are, what improvements would you make?
Okay, well, I promised to answer the question, but the first thing to say is prison is one of the very few areas of public life where we could spend less for a better result. Because sentences are too long. Our prison population is double what it was because we've loaded too much onto punishment. And the typical pattern is that if a government wants to do something which it is scared is a little bit liberal, it matches it with an announcement which is rough and tough. And the rough and tough thing always survives and the liberal thing kind of fades away because it's more complicated to do. So we should spend less. Having got the prison population down to a sensible level, I would then want to spend money on making conditions decent for everybody. So not expecting to hold people in 200-year-old prisons, not expecting people to share cells when they don't want to, not expecting people to go to prisons that are hundreds of miles from where they live and their families can never get to. Inside the prison, I've often thought, and this was brought home to me by a guy who ran one of the charities we worked with at Highdown, who was an investment banker by background. And we walked around the prison together and he just said, your capital is spectacularly underutilised, because he saw education blocks, he saw gyms, he saw playing fields, he saw greenhouses that were idle for all but about 4 hours a day. He said, you'd never get away with that in any other type of business. So I would love prisons to be a place where all that physical plant was available for the community to use. I'd love the boundary between prison and the community to be much more permeable, so there were loads of people in prison who could quite safely go out and work in the community and sleep in the prison. It's still exile, it's still a punishment. Some people do that, a very small number, and a very small number principally because there's a worry that they'll bring drugs back into the prison. Well, that's not about body searching and x-rays, that's about how you set up the incentives. Do you make it more worth someone's while to resist that pressure and bring them back into a prison where most people have that opportunity and don't want to lose it? Or do you say you're one of the 3 people who's going out in this prison of 1,000? Of course, every gangster in the place is going to put pressure on you to bring stuff back with you. So that's all possible, but it requires a change in mindset. And it's not free, it's not big money, and the business of using the prison's facilities in a more imaginative way is exactly what schools have done. A fantastic gym, a Highdown, and skilled staff to run it and to help people. And it just wasn't used for most of the time.
So if lengthy sentences aren't helping to stop crime, like what would? Now this is maybe a little bit outside the prison focus in itself, but we have a new government. What should they be doing with that massive majority?
I do think there's a confidence problem, and it's crucially important that particularly serious crime is investigated and is prosecuted, and the delays in the system at the moment are very corrosive to the way the public thinks about it, to victims, and also actually to the people who have or have not committed the crime. I mean, staggeringly, if you spend 2 years on remand in a prison and you're found innocent, you just walk out and that's it. There's no compensation, there's no grant. That's very wrong, so it's important to get that part of the system working well. In terms of reducing crime overall, again, the first thing to say is that crime has been reducing across the Western world for 20 to 30 years. And we've got a really good measure of that. It's not about what the police write down, it is about repeated surveys. which ask people about their experience of crime, and people's experience of crime has got better and better, while what they feel about crime has got worse and worse. So you know, a free thing politicians can do is not to scare people, not to talk about it in such dramatic fashion, and not to use sentencing as a way of demonstrating their tough credentials, because brutally nobody notices. It's a fascinating piece of research that shows that while sentence lengths have gone up for the crimes you would worry about, so rape, murder, GBH, that people's perception is that they've gone down. They think sentencing has become more lenient when it's become much, much more severe. And I think that's because if you say loudly enough, we're going to be tougher, of course people assume there's a problem. Of course they assume that things have been going in the other direction and you're reversing it, and that's a self-inflicted wound. The things about crime and about safety in community which are well known is that you must start early. So actually preschool, all the way through school. I mean, the statistics for the number of people in prison who have been excluded from school when they were about 12 or 13 are just horrific. People who found themselves in the care system. That's not that the care system creates criminal or that people who go to care are naturally criminal. It's just that they don't get all the things which help people through that really difficult stage in their life. Most crime is committed by people in their late teens, in their early 20s. If you can get safely through that period, then actually you've got much, much less of a crime problem. I mean, the other thing I think is that crime is changing. The things that people will experience on crime now will increasingly be to do with technology, to do with fraud, to do with how incredibly easy it is to nick things from shops. That's about design. That's not really about the criminal justice system at all. That's about designing things in a way where you don't lump it all onto the criminal justice system to solve it after the event, and forgetting about the idea that deterrence really does anything for anybody. I mean, you and I don't really need to be deterred. If we were really poor, if we saw no better option, threatening us doesn't really make any difference. And I've had that conversation with any number of prisoners who just say, you know, if you try and be tougher than me, Gov, of course you're not. You know, look at you. And that's true. It's just a silly, wasteful, ineffective way to respond.
After I was a lawyer, I did a stint on a death penalty law firm in Houston, in Texas, and they had all the stats as well. No deterrent effect whatsoever.
No.
None whatsoever. We have a couple of questions that we've been asking everybody as a part of this programme. Firstly, can you define Lincoln in 3 words?
I've watched previous editions, so I have given this some thought, and it was really difficult. Privileged, which is it's a privilege to be here, and it's privileged in its location, its buildings, its wealth, its situation. So that's the first one. The second one was reticent, which is kind of about not being a show-off. I mean, I like the fact that it was pretty low-key and didn't especially want to shout about its achievements. So I like that. And the third one was thoughtful. This is partly about my personal experience. I've been here for 3 weeks and I broke my jaw playing rugby, which meant that my teeth were wired together. So I got to know the chef, Jim, really, really well, and he just looked after me brilliantly. And I ate everything liquidised to a pulp, but it was brilliant. So it was thoughtful in that sense. I thought the people who taught us were thoughtful about us as individuals. But it's also thoughtful in the sense of making you think, and just being surrounded by people who require you to dig a bit deeper, you know, when you're asked a question.
Perfect. And finally, what advice would you give to the young people here at the moment, who are of course going to be stewards of the future?
Well, first piece of advice is don't forget how lucky you are and don't waste the opportunity. I mean, I think in many ways I did. I didn't do all the things that I could have done when I was here. I did do Morris dancing. I'd recommend Morris dancing to people. And the second thing, God, you might not like me for saying this, but I think really hard before you go into banking or law. You know, just think about what else might be out there. And if you go into banking or law and you're fed up 5 years down the line, don't be scared to change.
Very wise words. As a former lawyer, I can 100% agree with that. So Peter Dawson, thank you so much for joining us.
Oh, it's a great surprise to be asked and a real pleasure to do it. Thank you.